What I'd like to do now is talk about some horse-friendly comprehensive planning and zoning. And I mentioned this already, but I'm going to repeat myself a little bit about the horse-friendly comprehensive plan and the importance of making agriculture and the horse industry part of the plan. And again, demonstrate the value of the horse industry to the local economy, put that into the local economic base section of the comprehensive plan. Also talk about the importance of horses and the horse industry to community character, recreation opportunities, and way of life. Again, I mentioned Montgomery County, Maryland, because as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Department of Agriculture does not include the value of the equine industry when they produce their figures on the value of agriculture for a county. Let's talk about horse-friendly zoning. I'm going to talk about really two kinds of agricultural zones in some detail. First, what I call A1 agricultural zone, where agriculture is the preferred use. And you find an A1 agricultural zone in more rural areas. And each zone will have in the text a purpose clause. What's the purpose of this agricultural zone? And usually for an A1 zone, the purpose is the continuation of commercial agriculture. So some of the options that I've mentioned before, one would be the large minimum lot size of say 20 to 40 acres. And again, you tend to find these in the Midwest, Oregon, and California. Another option would be that fixed area ratio kind of zoning, say no more than 2 acres for every 20 acres or so. You find this in Lancaster County, and you find it in parts of Maryland as well. Setbacks for barns. Remember the La Habra Heights case where they tried to change the setback from 25 feet to 50 feet. In a rural area, 50 feet is probably reasonable setback from a property boundary. But it's also, I think, useful in your zoning ordinance to try to define what a commercial horse operation is. And you can define that by the number of horses, and you can certainly define it by the kind of buildings that you find, barns and riding rings and that sort of thing. There was an interesting case that I came across on the internet, and the case in Ipswich was a fellow bought a property there and that had 7 stalls. And the neighbors thought, well, that's okay because this is basically a residential area. And then the fellow proposed expanding from 7 to 17. And the neighbors got upset because they said, no, you're taking it now from a residential use to a commercial use. In addition, the landowner was proposing to build a quote-unquote guest apartment, which would be probably for a groom or somebody to manage the horses. And what was interesting is there had been an approval use variance on this property way back in 1973 that said, yes, we'll let you have the horses, but it has to remain a residential property. And then the town attorney said, no, it's agricultural and you can't stop the expansion of an agricultural operation. So you end up with two very different interpretations in this case. One of the things that I've learned in my years in agriculture is that there is a hierarchy in the smell of manure. And this is extremely important because, hog manure is the worst. Absolutely. And, we agree on that. Depending on your nose, it's either chicken or cows. It depends, But horse manure, is really just it's not all that bad. It really isn't. The final thing I just wanted to mention is that for horse-friendly zoning, you could have exemptions on height limitations for barns. Usually the height limitation is about 35 feet. That's pretty standard. And if you have a nice facility with a cupola on top, your cupola can be over 35 feet. So that's one reason why you can have an exemption that I think isn't going to block anybody, any neighbor's view or anything like that. So I think that's just common sense right there. I just wanted to show you briefly Montgomery County, Maryland, which has done a very nice job of preserving a lot of the area in here through conservation easements, various programs, as well as a program called Transfer of Development Rights. And they've done a nice job of creating large contiguous blocks of farmland. They have one block in there that's about 10,000 acres of contiguous farmland that's permanently preserved. And not too far away, this is Baltimore County, and you actually got some horses in here. And again, this is part of an area that's very well protected. The zoning in this area is 1 house per 50 acres, and there are also many farms that are under permanent conservation easements. Okay, horse-friendly zoning number 2, the A2 zone, and this is the agricultural residential type of zone where agriculture is permitted, but in general the area is in transition. It is developing. You're seeing more residential development coming in. Your purpose clause for, in this case will be, agriculture is a permitted use, is an acceptable use, but so is residential development. For zoning standards, you tend to find minimum lot sizes of between 2 and 5 acres. This is important for a number of reasons. One, if you're going to use an on-site septic system, the general rule of thumb is you want at least 2 acres because you're going to have a backup leach field as well. So there have been many cases throughout the United States where they've used half-acre or 1 acre lots with on-site septic, and if you have many of these next to each other, they often end up polluting the groundwater, and then you have to extend a sewer line way out into the countryside because you have a health issue. And I've seen that happen many times. So 2 acre minimum lot size makes sense. Again, the clustering option that I mentioned, if you cluster the development to leave more open space, that can certainly help maintain some pasture or trails. There's some places that I've seen that have used this equestrian overlay district to try to make equine uses really be the preferred use in an agricultural residential zoning district. So that's something else to consider. Some of these ordinances may try to establish a maximum number of horses per acre. In La Habra, it was 8 to the acre, for example. Setbacks for barns and fences, 25 feet in a may be acceptable. 50 feet may be better if you're concerned about complaints from neighbors. And issues about whether and where horses can be stabled or used for business purposes, boarding, training lessons, other things. And you're obviously going to have the manure removal and manure management issues, even more so in these agricultural residential areas. One of the other things that I want to mention in ag residential areas is you often have the situation of people, what's called coming to the nuisance, and that is the newcomers who want to locate next to the horse farms and then complain about how the horse farms are operated. The flip side, though, is that when newcomers come, they often bring 2 things that don't necessarily mix well with horses, and that is dogs and kids. And they will say, wow, I'm out in the country, I don't have any leash laws here, I can just let my dogs run wild. This happened to a friend of mine who actually was a sheep farmer, and every night one of his neighbors would let his dogs out, and the dogs would go over and hassle his sheep, and of course he had sheep dogs, and the sheep dogs would be barking at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, and he wasn't getting any sleep. So that was a real problem. But it's a matter of being good neighbors, both ways. And so when people move out to the countryside, they have to recognize that that they have to be good neighbors as well with people who are already out there. So this is often how this ag residential can look. I like to say this looks like the alien landing zone in the Peruvian desert, but this is actually outside of Denver, Colorado. These tend to be, 5-acre, 10-acre types of places. Heck of a lot of roads that you need to put in to service that pattern of development, but people like their space, especially out in the West. And then this is the Hudson Valley of New York, and I love this picture because the horses are totally unimpressed with the houses up here. They could care less. But in the Hudson Valley of New York, you tend to find basically 2- and 3-acre minimum lot sizes, even though it does have some very good agricultural land. I mentioned agricultural districts, so I won't belabor this slide. Again, I just want to point out that they are voluntary, do not impose any land use restrictions on landowners. Again, they do vary somewhat from state to state, and again, the greater protection against eminent domain is often the main reason why landowners enroll their property into these agricultural districts. Did I get this right? Yeah, here we go. This is Lexington, Fayette County, Kentucky, but planning and zoning can really set the stage for voluntary land preservation. And what they did in Lexington, Fayette is very interesting. They have this urban service area, which is also known as an urban growth boundary, and their sewer and water lines are inside here. So this is where they're promoting dense development. And what they've done, I think very impressively, is 95% of the population of Lexington Fayette is located inside this urban growth area. And planners like this kind of thing because planners generally don't like sprawl very much. And if you have a vibrant city here in Lexington, it's going to be a lot cheaper and easier to service those people with sewer and water, schools, and all that sort of thing than if they were spread out through the countryside. Out here in the countryside, the zoning is 1 house per 40 acres, so it's really quite strict. And these green areas, these are farms that were preserved either through donation of conservation easements or through the purchase of conservation easements. And there are about 25,000 acres now in Lexington, Fayette County that are permanently preserved. So here are my closing thoughts. Good neighbors, and coming from Vermont, I know something about what Robert Frost said about good fences make good neighbors. So maintain your fences. You really do need to educate non-horse neighbors about your horse operation. There's one farmer I know in Lancaster County who every year he invites his neighbors over for a barbecue because he's just, I want to know my neighbors, I want to understand my neighbors, I want them to know and like me. I have another friend who has a big dairy operation. He has 43 neighbors. and he also farms in a wellhead protection area, which is, public drinking water supply underneath his farm. So he has to be very careful. He has to be a very good neighbor, and he does really take a lot of time to be a good neighbor. Maintain your property. Your property is really a form of advertising about yourself, about what you're interested in. And if you maintain a nice property, then it says good things about you. Avoid going to court if possible. I'm not trying to reduce the income of certain attorneys who may be present, but my brother happens to be one of these people too. Anyway, but my brother has an interesting attitude. He, as an attorney, he said, well, if you go to court, that means you failed as an attorney. That's the way he looks at it. He said, the whole idea is to be able to work out your differences without going to court. And really organize as horse owners because, as they say, vigilance is its own reward. And the logo I have down here is from an interesting place called the Malpai Borderlands Group, which is down in New Mexico and Arizona, where those two states meet with Mexico. And they've gotten together. They're ranchers fundamentally, and they've preserved a lot of their land and worked together very much as a community very successfully. And it's really quite an impressive story if you want to look it up on the internet. So I want to thank you very much for your attention this morning. I appreciate your questions and your comments, and hope to talk to you some more at lunch. And thank you again for bringing me down here. It's really been a lot of fun. Thank you.